All right, thank you for joining me today and to explore together the 50 shades of openness that we can observe today in generative AI. There were a lot of talks in the keynote sessions yesterday and specifically today regarding what is open, what is open source, what is openness in AI. And I want to just illustrate a few examples to raise maybe your reflections on the subject. So I'm Raphaël Semete. You might have already understood that from my accent that I'm from the other side of the channel, so sorry for my English. I discovered open source at university in 1997 and started to work with or around open source professionally in 2004. So it's quite a long time that I'm involved in this domain. I created the QSOS method. You may have heard about it. It's a method to evaluate, compare, and select open source project and open source components. I'm also a certified yoga teacher. I'm an architect. I like to design things, to build systems, and I did that in many, many different domains like government, health, transportation, banking, anything. I'm now head of DevRel at Worldline. Worldline is a global payment company. We're the best, we're all over the world, whatever. We also deal with project or product involving a huge amount of volumes or critical volumes. Like here, for instance, in the UK, we're involved in rails and transportation. Just maybe something to check. Who already heard about Worldline before today? Please raise your hand. All right. 2 people. Well, now you do. So maybe another exercise. Who ever heard about LLM? All right. That's yes, LLM is quite the hype. That's all we do for yoga exercise, huh? Raising hands. That's it. Yes, so yes, LLM is quite the buzzword today. Everybody's speaking about it. So we're speaking about language models. So a few years back, we had already algorithms dealing with semantics, but those algorithms were not powerful enough, and the results were not of that quality that we observe today. Everything changed in this, from that matter in 2017 with the publication of a research paper by people from Google called Attention is What You Need, and they introduced a new method to do machine learning, which is called transformers, with the attention mechanism, and they did implement the year after open source implementation of it called BERT, and this unlocked the limitation that we had previously and opened the area of large language models. So we were able to deal with a larger context that we input to the models, and then unlock also the hardware parallel computation that we were able to do with such models. And this paved the way to generative AI and all the hype that we observe and we live today. For me, coming from an open source background and the end user of everything, even if I do contribute to open source also, is Gen AI is having its Linux moment today. The comparison with open source is interesting because they both were born in labs and universities where researchers are used to share and collaborate on code and algorithm. All right, and to build on top of each other. So there's a kind of openness in the research domain. And before the hype, they were used to exchange and publish papers, still doing that, and even share some codes to improve the models. Then it was gradually adopted by individuals and by enterprises, creating $1 billion, pounds, euros businesses, with a lot of opportunities, creating new ecosystems. And I speak about Linux moment because now, especially in the open source domain, but not only, you of course have a lot of alternative models available, but also the tooling. Somebody right before was speaking about usability of things. You have frameworks to ease the implementation of LLM-based application. You have LLM cache, LLM proxies, you have guardrails, and everything, all of that is available in open source also. So it's very, very easy now to build and to design system, including LLM. And actually, that's what I live in my company today. A lot of people who are not from the research part are starting to use LLMs to implement some new use case or to improve their products or things like that. And it remembers me because I'm kind of also the unofficial open source officer in my company. And it remembers me a lot the behavior regarding open source and the awareness that we have to raise around that, because at the beginning people say, oh, it's open source, it's very easy to use, so let's use and build solutions with that, and then they discover that there are licenses that are framing what you can do or cannot do with those components. And it's basically the same thing with models, and that's why I want to showcase and navigate with you through the different shades of openness that we have in open source. To do that, I asked my fellow Luchin Zhang, who is an AI researcher in Worldline Labs, because obviously in Worldline we are doing AI for a long time because we are in the payment and we do a lot of fraud detection. So we have researchers trying to find the best way to detect fraud and anticipate that kind of problems. But now, LLMs are becoming mainstream and adopted by end users and developers, okay? So I asked him, okay, what should we check when we want to estimate, to assess the openness of a large language model? So he came up with this schema, which is, I don't know how familiar you are with LLMs, but basically I wanted to pinpoint what are the artifacts that we should check and assess. So first, the obvious first part is the model itself, whether we're speaking about foundational model or fine-tuned model that are derived from the foundational model, but basically the model itself. And what he told me is yes, it's not that much about the algorithm, because when you're AI researchers, as soon as you read the paper and you understood the algorithm, you're able to implement it, but it's about the weight, because the weight is the result of the training of the model, and then you're able to use the model without training it again. All right? So how accessible, how open is the model? That's the first part. The second part, and it was mentioned already in some of the keynotes this morning also, is the data set. Because it's all about data at the end of the day. So whether it's the pre-training data set, so large data set that are used to train and pre-train the foundational models, or fine-tuned, smaller, more specialized, maybe task-oriented, depending on the task that we want the model to be specialized on, that is used to fine-tune the model. This is important, this aspect of openness also, because that's where you can put all the safety, all the checks that we want to do about how responsible the AI will be. It's also very important regarding inclusivity. You know, how representative is the model. Today, models, the first models were trained in Western Europe or North America. They're not that representative of all the world, you know. So it's about gender equity, it's about languages, it's about inclusion, and it's about humanity at the end of the day. So this is important to assess how open, how can I have access to this model, and maybe change it if I want to change the inclusivity level of it, all right? Then, for the model, when it's reinforced by humans, there is also an intermediate model that can be produced that is called the reward model. And how can I access to this reward model also? And at the end of the day, what code is available? So again, Luchin told me it's not the code of the algorithm itself of the model, it's the data processing code. So all the heavy lifting that is done to implement all these processes of pre-training the model, fine-tuning the model, cleaning the data, injecting the reward model, or that kind of stuff, he says that's the part when it's open and accessible, it's very easy for other people to reproduce and to do, for instance, their own version of a fine-tuned model based on what was done by others. All right? So based on those different artifacts, we created this matrix to assess the level of openness of those different points, with ranging from 0, so it's completely closed. You don't have any access to anything regarding the artifact, whether it is the model, the data set, the code, etc. To 4, it's totally open, and totally open will be in an open source way. Let's say that you have access and you have the right to reuse, change, and redistribute without any restriction. And in between, you have one. It's when it's behind a paper or a paywall. So you have access, but you have to have the grant, the permission from somebody to access it. So whether it's for commercial use or for research use only, for instance. 2 is access, oh no, sorry. 1 is when it's only published. I mean, it's the wallpaper. 2 is when you have you require a special agreement to access to the artifact. And 3, it's open, but you may have some restriction about what you can do with the artifact. And basically, that's where enter into the game the Open Rail. I don't know if you heard about that kind of license. It's Open Responsible AI licenses. Basically, it's based on the concept of open source licenses, but they put some restriction on usage. So by the open source definition, it's not open source. All right? And we'll see with examples that some of the communities, the project, or the companies involved in LLMs are using that kind of licenses. So what I'd like to do now, from now on, is to use this matrix and try to evaluate some of the LLMs, just to explain, not all of them, there are many of them, but just to discuss and showcase the 50 shades of openness that we can observe today. All right? So please take a deep breath, relax, and keep bearing with me. That's the last part of yoga in my presentation. All right? So let's start with the big players. OpenAI. OpenAI is interesting because it started as a non-profit organization, hence the name, OpenAI, to advance the artificial intelligence for the sake and the well of humanity. So the first version of the large language model, GPT, version 1 and 2, was quite open. The model was totally open, so you had access, you can change it and redistribute your modification without any restriction. The data set and the code, not available, described in the research paper, but then you don't have access to it, so you don't really know what it is about. All right? But then with the hype and with the business and the change in strategies and with investment of VC, of big players like Microsoft with billions of dollars, or even if it's hardware or compute time on Azure platform, for instance, they did change their strategy, so they didn't change their name, but now it's definitely closed. So we're starting with version 3 and 4, everything's closed. You don't have access to anything, no code, nothing. ChatGPT, which is a fine-tuned version of GPT for chat and conversation with humans, is also described just in a research paper. You don't have access to any of the artifacts. So here we see there's a change in the strategy. That's why we are in the Linux moment. You have this tug of war between commercial and openness strategies. They closed everything. But there is something even more interesting, is the restriction they put on the usage. So even if it's closed, they do restrict the usage that you can make about what is coming out from the model, what they call output. So if you check the term of use of OpenAI, there is this sentence is, you may not use output to develop models that compete with OpenAI. This is very important, okay? Because they restrict also the usage. And they say, don't use OpenAI to do another LLM that will compete. So what does it mean, compete with OpenAI? That depends, but definitely we think it's about commercial and competition, all right? So it's a way to reduce competition, to do that kind of stuff. So it's closed, but there's also a restriction on what you can do with the model, all right? Another player, interesting one, is Google. Definitely Google started in the open also. I mentioned the paper, attention is what you need, the BERT. The BERT model was also completely open, so model and the code were available, and you can change it in any way you want. The data set, you had some restriction on accessing the data set, so it was not that open, but then we observed the same transition, the same change in strategy with the new generation of Google's large language model, speaking about Palm 2 and Gemini. And there also they closed everything. All right? So now the models are described in published research papers, but that's all you got. So you can't have your own version of Palm 2 or your own version of Gemini. All right? It's behind the paying API, and it's a black box. Okay? So interesting to see that they did quite the same as OpenAI did. Another interesting player is Meta. So Meta is making a lot of noise because, especially in the open source communities, people say, oh, they say they're open source, but they're not. There's a lot of discussion, and we are touching now the very concept of what is openness in LLM. So Meta, they started in the open also. Roberta was one of the earlier models, so definitely recognize BERT in the name. So the code and the model were completely open and available, and the data set was even easier to access. All right? And then they changed also the strategy, entered the game, but they did decide to allow people to reuse their model. Okay? So even if it's not open source, because we'll see it's a 3, it's not a 4, because they put some restriction about the usage, but they said we allow people to reuse the model. At the beginning, it was only the algorithm, but then the weights were leaked. I don't know if it was on purpose on their side, but it was done. So now we consider that it's a level 3 openness of the model itself, all right? The data set and the code, you don't know about. It's only described in the research paper, so they do some statistics about how inclusive it is or not, and then we see it's not that inclusive, all right? But what is interesting is they put a restriction on the usage you can make of the model. That's why it's not open source per se. If you look at the additional commercial terms, there is this sentence that is very important. That says, okay, if you want to make a hosted service based on Llama 2 with more than 7 million monthly active users, then you have to talk with us. Definitely, we'll have to talk about money and have a special license. So you might argue, okay, 700 million active users in a month is quite a lot. It is. But it's, again, a way to restrict the competition, and it's a way to restrict the usage. So by the definition of the open source initiative, this is not open source, because they put a restriction on that, on the model itself. Okay? But whether it's open source or a little bit more open than the other models, they did allow people to reuse the model. And that paved the way to something very interesting. Starting in the research community, those are offsprings of the llama, so alpaca and vicuna. So you see that researchers are good at humor and play on words, right? So two universities in the US, they did their own fine-tuned version of Llama. Okay, so what they inherit the openness of the foundational model they're based on, all right, which is Llama 2. So it's open with the limitation they have. So they inherit this limitation. All right. The pre-training data set is not known because it's the one of Meta. And then they added their own fine-tuning data set. Okay? So all the human-based interaction to fine-tune the model and make it available as a fine-tuned model. All right. What they did, though, is they use results from ShareGPT. ShareGPT is a collaborative platform where people share the result of their discussion with the GPT, so the OpenAI model. And by doing so, they inherit the restriction from OpenAI. Don't compete with us. So it's very interesting, this example, because they have two sets of limitations, one coming from Llama 2 and the other one coming from OpenAI, even if it's indirect because it's coming from their fine-tuning data set. Okay, that's why we have to be careful and aware about what are the artifacts and what is the level of openness of each of the artifacts to understand what are the restrictions that we could have on the model. Basically, this means that's for research only, those models. Because if you are doing some business with it, One day, somebody from OpenAI or maybe Yama might come to you and say, oh, by the way, do you know about the restriction? This OpenAI restriction is interesting. That's how they closed the TikTok account. Because they saw that TikTok was training a model based on the result from GPT, and so they closed the model. They closed it. All right. So, but then in the collaborative and open, I say open, not open source, open community, some people started to say, okay, let's create our own foundational models to allow others to build on top of us. All right? So that's how we have this table. I just picked some of the models. Some of them are well known, some less known, but it's just to illustrate the 50 shades I'm talking about. All right? What is interesting here to see is you have non-profit organization, you have a private commercial organization, you have a project that were born in the US, in the Emirates, or in Europe. The first one, Elifer AI, it was mentioned today in the keynote. It's very interesting because they kept the line of the GPT. You remember at the beginning, GPT was open. So they say, let's continue on this line with GPT. So they released GPT-J and GPT-Neo and GPT-X and etc. What is very interesting is here the model, the code is completely open. So we could say open source because you can reuse it. Actually, it's under open source license. The data set is open, but there is a limitation. The limitation I found, because I'm a sneaky guy. I'm very used to look at the details and stuff. And these sentences, data set fuzziness is taken from their website, is please refer to the specific license depending on the subset you use. So basically, we didn't really care about how the data set was made. That's your job to do if you want to use it. So be careful about that. Because one day somebody can come and say, oh, this data set, the pile, has some problem, and if you're using the model, then you might have some problems based on the pile. All right? Then, what is interesting also is the Falcon model. I don't know if you heard about it. It's coming from the Emirates Institute, Research Institute in the Emirates. They created their own model. So it's open, but we'll see there are some limitations. This time they created a brand new data set, and they said the data set is completely free of use. You can reuse it, access it, train your own model with it. There's no restriction on that, and that's very important in the community also to build data set, because at the end of the day it's all about data, what the LLM knows, the model knows. All right. Then the code, you just have a general instruction, but you don't have the details. Another example is Bloom. It's the result of a consortium of many research institutes in Europe to create their own model. And they basically put some limitation with the notion of open rail, so a responsible AI license on the model itself. So basically, they restrict the use, do not do harm, do not do that kind of stuff. So per the open source definition, again, it's not open source, right? OpenYama is another project to build a Yama-based or Yama-like LLM, but this time more open. So basically, the model and the data set are open, and the code, you just have examples, right? Another example coming from France, just like me, is Mistral. So it's a private company with guys coming from Google and Meta formerly, who decided also to create an open model. So yes, the model is open source. You can reuse it. You can have access to the weights and stuff. You have access to the code also, but the data set, you don't have that many information about how the model was trained, right? But whether it is open or not, it's important, again, to see, just like with OpenAI, the limitation that we can put. I took this one from Falcon, because it's very interesting. Falcon, when it's presented to the public, they say, we're open source, we're under an Apache 2 license. And then when you look at the details, well, we made a few modifications on the license. And the devil being in the detail, it's a huge one, because they say, if you want to host something based on Falcon, then you may require something from us. So again, we're restricting the use. And this reminds me of the drama we had when cloud emerged, because open source license, they were created before the cloud area. Only Richard Stallman anticipated that, and they say that's going to be a problem. So that's why we saw a lot of change in some of the project to fight against the cloud service providers, saying, okay, you're not distributing the modified version, but you're still not contributing to the project, so we should try to change our license to do that. And here you see there's the same kind of attempt to say, okay, but if you're doing something with the model on the cloud, then you should have some restriction, or we should have control about what you're doing. Right? So this allowed the creation of fine-tuned models, fine-tuned version, because we are in the community. So basically, the objective of the foundational models is achieved. Other projects, other countries are able to reuse the model and fine-tune it. Okay? So just for example here, so one is coming from Databricks with the Dolly. So again, play on word, Yama, Dolly. All right. So it's based on Eliffer GPT-J version. So it inherits the openness of the foundational data model. And then they created their own data set. Okay? And this data set is completely open, so anybody can access to it. And what they did also, they did release the code of all the data processing they made for anybody, any other company, any other individual, I mean, to be able to reproduce that and create his own version of a fine-tuned model. So that's interesting. No information about any reward model, though. Bloom Chat, you infer it from the name, is also derived from the Bloom European Research Program. Okay? And you see here, they used for the fine-tuning dataset, they used the Dolly dataset that was created, and the Lion dataset. It was mentioned by the guy from Stability AI just before, all right, to train and to fine-tune their own model. Okay? And they do restrict the use of the code with an open rail. So you see the open rail license there is applied on the code this time. Okay? Then Zephyr. Zephyr is interesting because it's a fine-tuned model of Mistral. So they were able and allowed to fine-tune the model. But what they did, they used results coming from OpenAI again. So I don't know if they were aware of that or not. It's people from Hugging Face, huh? the Zephyr model. But then they might have the restriction, the initial restriction from OpenAI, don't compete with us. All right? And then the code is available, but with some restriction. And last example is LLM 360, which argues to be very open, the best open model. Everybody's saying that now. What is interesting here is basically, yes, the model, the data set, even for the foundational model, are completely open. They reused Red Pajama and other data sets that are completely free and we could say open source. The code also is open, but again, for the fine-tuning data set, they use results from OpenAI. So from that perspective, it's not that open, and you could have restriction about what you can do with the model. So what we can say is basically be aware about the restriction also, because here, for example, it's taken from Bloom Chat. So use restriction, do not provide medical advice with that. Do not do something that is linked with justice, law enforcement, or immigration. So again, this can't be called open source because you put some limitation. So it's not that I'm against or for that kind of limitation, but you should be aware about what you can not do. And this is framed by the license, but also by the terms of use. All right? So we spoke a lot about the models and the licenses, and I spoke about 3 minutes, the Linux moment that the Gen AI is having now. It's all possible because we're speaking about communities also. And one key player is Hugging Face. It's a real enabler of open collaboration and reuse. They're well known for their own transformers, open source libraries, and for the LLM leaderboard, but they're kind of the GitHub of AI now, and they really enable collaboration and cooperation on models. There are many, many models and dataset shares on the platform, and it's very easy for people to build on top of each other and to share their own discovery and models. They also provide some hosting services. If you want to have your own version, your own instance of a model and use it for your application, for instance, it's possible. Then you have to pay, all right? And regarding hosting paradigm, for me, I observe two different paradigms, two different competing paradigms. The first one is centralized one. So closed model, basically, they lead to black boxes and hyper-centralization, a lot of energy consumption. And there is a kind of crazy race for the bigger model with the big amount of parameters and that kind of stuff. What I observe is in this gold rush, the new shovel sellers are the cloud service providers, all right? Because they're very interested in you, in giving them money to run those very expensive models, all right? So that's why, and maybe that's why, maybe, I don't know, Meta, who is not a CSP, did decide to open their model, maybe. On the other hand, you have this collaborative and distributed and open way of seeing things, and democratizing AI with two aspects. The first one is to adapt the model and allow them to run on any standard PC, container, or servers, all right? With a mechanism like quantization. There's a lot of research also done on AI chips to equip every PC, every server with capacity to run those models. And then the emergence also of smaller models, because new use cases are coming up with edge computing and a mobile device. And you see now even the big players like Google and Microsoft or Huawei are training and releasing a smaller model to run on your mobile device. All right? You can have also verticals, and AI democratization is still going on because there's a lot of innovation done in this field. So all the actors that we observe today, the shift and the landscape may be reshaped by that. Key takeaway, and I'm finished, from this very, very short presentation about this interesting subject. For me, there's a tug of war between commercial, private, black box, and open, distributed, and collaborative creation of language model. The world is not unicolor, so there's a space for everybody. Ownership leads to black boxes. Openness is good for competition and innovation also. And inclusivity is very important. That's why transparency is key when we speak about those languages. On the other hand, as I said, Gen AI is still in a very dynamic field, and there's a lot of things going on regarding AI democratization, and we see that with, I'm sure that Apple is cooking something to bring AI on iPhones, and that will change the game again. Okay, but again, we always have to be aware about licenses, because there's a new trend, for instance, which is a new mechanism which is called mixture of model. When instead of having big model, you have several fine-tuned models, smaller ones, and then you have kind of a routing mechanism depending on what you want to do. But be careful, if you mix model, at the end of the day, you have to mix licenses also. So again, you have to be aware of that. Thank you for your attention.